Venk. 12th Army had 8 infantry divisions made up of raw recruits and remnants. Northwest of Berlin was the formation optimistically named 11th Army, commanded by SS General Felix Steiner. 11th Army had only a police division, a marine division, and later a division of Panzer Grenadiers. Straddling the Oder, with the Russian bridgehead at Kustrin only a few miles downstream, was the city of Frankfurt, now designated a fortress. On April the 12th, Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, visited General Busse, the commander of 9th Army. Goebbels spoke to Busse's staff, assuring them that fate was on the German side and promising a miracle that would, at a stroke, revive the Reich's fortunes. In an extraordinary twist of fate, that evening Goebbels learned of the death of American President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The news of Roosevelt's passing threw Hitler into a fever of excitement. Not even word that Vienna had fallen to the Soviets could dampen his spirits. The war, Hitler now declared, would be won at the gates of the German capital. There, the Red Army would be drawn into battle and then, encircled from outside, destroyed in an historic German victory. At the very least, the battle would win time, during which the alliance between the Western powers and the Russians would inevitably collapse. On April the 14th, the day after Hitler's ecstatic pronouncement, Russian artillery on the Oder front began to pound German positions around the bridgeheads. Although the sudden Russian onslaught took the Germans completely by surprise, it soon became apparent that this was not the start of the main offensive. It was a reconnaissance in force, mounted by battalion-sized units of infantry and tanks, the prelude to most Soviet offensives. For the German commander of Army Group Vistula, General Heinrici, the question now was exactly when the real blow would fall. If he could guess the Soviet timetable correctly, he might save the bulk of his force on the Oder from instant annihilation. On April the 15th, there was a lull in the fighting around the Oder bridgeheads. At Kustrin, Marshal Zhukov's breakthrough force of 4 infantry and 2 tank armies stood poised for the signal. Behind the front, thousands of aircraft waited, some with targets already identified, others ready to respond to calls from the ground forces. Further south, Konev's 5 infantry and 2 tank armies also waited. With no bridgeheads, they would have to force a crossing of the river Neisse in the teeth of the enemy. The first to strike, in the early hours of April the 16th, would be Marshal Zhukov's first Belarusian front. Zhukov's plan was a novel one. After a massive pre-dawn artillery bombardment by 10,000 guns and 400 Katyusha rocket launchers designed to pulverize the German front line, 140 anti-aircraft searchlights would be turned on to blind the defenders as the infantry rushed their trenches. What Zhukov did not know was that Heinrici had correctly deduced the time of the Russian attack. Opposite Zhukov's bridgehead, the first line of German defences ran parallel to the Russians, along the flat valley floor of the Oder. 5 miles behind was a sandy ridge, 200 feet high, called the Zielau Heights. The ground between the heights and the Oder Valley was intersected by canals, a small river, and numerous streams and drainage ditches. At the foot of the heights were 2 German defence lines, while on the heights themselves the Germans had prepared their main positions. Mortar pits, anti-tank guns, machine gun emplacements, and dug-in tanks and assault guns completely commanded the plain below. Manning the defences were elements of General Busse's 9th Army. On the night of April the 15th, most units were withdrawn with their heavy weapons to the second line of defence, leaving only a covering force behind. The 9th Luftwaffe Parachute Division, the 20th Panzer Grenadier Division, and the Müncheberg Panzer Division in reserve now held fortified positions, the strength of which Marshal Zhukov had completely failed to comprehend. The awesome barrage that heralded the start of Zhukov's offensive began at 3 a.m. on the morning of April the 16th. In 30 minutes, 500,000 shells rained down on the German front line, rolling onwards to a depth of 5 miles. The effect was stupefying, a concentration of destructive power never before seen in the history of warfare. In fact, Zhukov's plan was already coming badly unstuck. The searchlights, reflected back by clouds of dust and smoke, were blinding the attackers, who were stumbling about amongst the ditches. Even more disturbing, the enemy's frontline trenches were all but deserted. Suddenly, heavy German fire rained down from the Zielau Heights. By dawn, the Russians had still made little progress. Bunched together and obstructed by waterways, they were easy targets for German gunners. The day was well advanced before the Russians reached solid ground below the heights, and there, under a hail of shells, the offensive ground to a halt. The effect of the unexpected setback on Marshal Zhukov was to send him into a towering rage. Even now, he could see the prize that was rightfully his, snatched away by Marshal Konev. On Konev's Nysa front, the opening barrage had begun at 4:15 a.m. along a 250-mile line. At the same time, massed bombers of the Second Air Army pulverized German rear areas and communications. One 18-mile sector in particular was saturated with high explosives.